Can you, as someone who studies the far right, can you just kind of lay the ground for what happened, what the involvements of different organizations were that we know of, how law enforcement was infiltrated?
We don't know the degree to which law enforcement is infiltrated.
Sure.
We know from ground level work for decades. My colleague Elizabeth Hinton is working on this. Black community has been telling us for decades that law enforcement has been infiltrated by the far right. So in the last 4 years, Donald Trump has clearly been courting the far right among law enforcement. He's been courting law enforcement. They've been backing off. The Obama administration, I really think we need to protect civil liberties. On the other hand, I want my family to be safe. And so somebody needs to, there's a lot of it's been left to independent actors to track the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Proud Boys. One thing we know, and, is that there are a lot more Proud Boys than you think. If we think of this as fascism, we're going to be able to understand this. We're going to be able to understand that it's not just it wasn't the working class among the insurrectionist terrorist mob attacking the Capitol. That was not the poor, disenfranchised working class. There was a 3-time Olympic gold medalist in the middle of them. Thinking about it as fascism makes you realize, no, it's not the poor, disenfranchised working class. This is the auto dealers, the owners of auto dealerships. This is the business people. This is a lot of people in America, and a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump are not down for this. A lot of people who vote for Donald Trump are scared of communists, scared of, or against, are pro-life, but are anti-taxes. But Donald Trump has massively expanded the ranks of the far right. And we don't know because Donald Trump's various enforcement agencies are not tracking that. We just have Talia Lavin and a bunch of independent actors, the Southern Poverty Law Center, who are tracking this. So we need Germany. There's a lot of attention paid to Germany because Germany has realized they have a lot of far right in their law enforcement, a lot of neo-Nazis. We've had 4 years of completely ignoring. We know already we had a big problem. We need to know, we know that there are not 74 million fascists in America. That's absurd. But there are more than there were 4 years ago. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Katie, if I could just jump in real quick here, and just to speak to this directly too. I mean, the Capitol Police, in terms of what we know, I think worth noting, their holiday party in 2019 was at the Trump Hotel. When I lived in DC for 15 years, there's one fraternal order of police lodge there for Metropolitan Police, Capitol Police, and also Metro PD. So they actually have 3 different unions, but they're in one FOP. They endorsed Trump in 2016. They were then forced to retract it because some black officers inside of the union had protested. Those are the politics of those people. The president of that DC FOP has a history of liking at least white supremacist adjacent websites. And I can say for sure, because I work directly on this, the internal culture of the Metropolitan Police Department is very similar. There was a case I worked on a few years ago where there was these T-shirts basically that were mocking the black community. They were part of something called the Power Shift Crew, the most oppressed working class black community of DC. And there was this jump outs, which is like stop and frisk on wheels. And one thing they would always say when they would jump out at people is, show me your waistband, Joe, because in DC, Joe is like a thing people say, and they roll up real quick, guns pulled, terroristic practice. So they had these shirts that were the Grim Reaper and all sorts of violent imagery and the show me your waistband, Joe, which, the whole community was outraged because it was obviously mockery of this community. And so that's deeply rooted in these officers. And then, I also want to take it one level higher too, because, obviously there was some discrepancy over why the National Guard issue was not called out when they were supposed to. There's the officer from Capitol Police who was anonymously interviewed by Daily Beast, who was saying there was an explicit lack of leadership at all times, anywhere. And by the way, also noted that he said half the people rhetorically or anecdotally in the force voted for Trump. So, we'll see if there's a real investigation here. But I think to me, and I agree with what Jason is saying here too, sometimes I think there's there can be a literary element to it in terms of how we look at it. I mean, my own view is, I think Trump, I don't view Trump as ideologically as a fascist, but I don't know if that's the point. I mean, I think if you look at the history even of Germany, the Brunigs, the Van Poppens, the people who thought they were they were the ones who ultimately facilitated his rise. So I think Trump and many Republicans, I mean, the Republican Attorney General's Association is doing robocalls for this rally. Turning Point USA is bringing 80 buses here. I mean, it seems relatively clear to me that even if these people aren't fascist, that, they are in a marriage of convenience with, these either people who are actually fascist or adjacent to it. And I think that's the other thing that's relevant and also mentioned by Jason, and I think that a lot of us are also talking about and considering in general, is if we recognize that the Jim Crow South was basically a fascist dictatorship and the role of racist, violent mobs in the overthrow of Reconstruction, there's like a red, white, and blue fascism, certainly learned from the Nazis, that allows people to present as a defense of bourgeois democracy, an extremely authoritarian politic. And perhaps, we can quibble about what that's called, but I think that's very dangerous and very scary. And the differences with that sort of American DNA sort of weaved in there, I think is what can make it so dangerous, because I do think we should talk about everything that, Germany, Italy, Modi in India, Bolsonaro, we should be looking at all the parallels. But I think that sort of typical Americanness can kind of lull us into a sense of false security in a way. And then the final thing I'll just say about that is, and this is just a historical point, I think we should appreciate more than ever the anti-fascist elements of the civil rights movement and the banishing of Jim Crow and the expansion and belief that there should be broad democratic equal rights for all people, which is pretty much a product of that struggle. And as we see the gains of that struggle fading, no surprise, we see these forces coming back. So wherever Trump himself is situated, I think there's a lot to be said. But I want to see how high this thing goes. I think there's a lot of questions. As someone who was once almost maced in the face at point blank range in the Capitol for talking too loud at a peaceful sit-in, something was going on, and it wasn't just rank and file officers, although I think they were also involved, and it seems clear. So yeah, I just wanted to interject briefly with that.
Everything Eugene said.
Yeah. Except hopefully you weren't almost maced at that point. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, but you're co-signing that. Yeah. No, I mean, and something we may want to bring in our next guest, because I think something really fascinating about this. And again, I know we don't want to be too academicological. Is that a word?
But
we should make it one, though. I certainly can. That's the whole point. I'm reclaiming this. But no, not to make it too literary, as you said, or historiographical. But there is a whole discussion of what the ideology of fascism is, and how part of fascism, right, is its ideological flexibility. So on that note, why don't we bring in two historians who can interrogate this and problematize this?
As a history major from Howard University, I'm also historians and a reference to a Howard University commencement. It's a good start here from my university.
So without any further ado, Daniel Bessner, welcome. Nice new glasses.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you.
And Sam Moyn, I like the glasses just the way they are. Don't think they're new, but I like
they're the same as last time.
They're the same as last time. Yeah. And Daniel is a historian. He is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and also an editor at Jacobin. And Sam is a professor of law and history at Yale University. So what do you guys have? I just wanted to give you the chance to intervene. I'm trying to drop all these academic words.
Perfect. Well, Katie, I just want to say also thanks for having me on, and it's a pleasure to finally meet Jason. Jason, hello, and thanks for joining. And Eugene, good to see you again. So it's funny. I think Jason said to me online a couple of times that we agree more than we disagree, and I think on the whole that's right. I think we share a general framework of the world and what caused Donald Trump ultimately, and what we need to do going forward. But listening to him talk, I think I just want to highlight what I think we disagree on, and maybe we could go from there, and the discussion could go wherever it may go. First, I think we just fundamentally disagree on the political efficacy of the fascism analogy, and that might be because I partly focus on liberal anti-fascism. I understand and respect the left-wing tradition from which Jason emerges, and I mean, I would probably certainly broadly align myself with that, absolutely. My criticism of the analogy, though, comes from the fact that in my reading of history, it's been liberal anti-fascism forming the foundation of the modern liberal technocratic state that has actually been just historically more efficacious, that it's been more powerful. And so I am worried just fundamentally about the deployment of the analogy and how it will be taken up by the Biden administration. And I think it's the fact that Jason is very much on the left, I know, but a lot of the people who were promoting the analogy were very much not on the left, and they were deploying it to particular political ends. And there might just be a fundamental disagreement about the political efficacy of it. And we'll see, time will tell who's right and who's not right. I also just, as a historian who studied Nazi Germany very closely, particularly the last 5 years of the Weimar Republic's, German history as well, the last 5 years of the Weimar Republic's collapse, the literal micro-history of 1928 to 1933, I just don't see what's happening today in the United States as particularly analogous to that very unique situation of post-World War I Germany, a generation of scarred veterans, years of street battles, the particular chaos of a German state that had not been democratic for very long, and various other traumas that happened in Germany in the post-World War I period. The United States has had its fair share of traumas, from Iraq to Afghanistan to an awful legacy of racism that permeates everything we do, to indigenous genocide. I just don't think the proximate causes of what's happening today are meaningfully analogous to what happened in the Germany of the 1920s. And while I agree with everyone that there is a real danger posed by the far right, I think it's important to investigate why so many people have found QAnon appealing, particularly since the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of the Proud Boys and these sorts of organizations. I think I guess fundamentally, when one is making that call between the threat posed by the far right to the Republic and the cost in civil liberties that it will actually cost to combat that right by an American state run by the Joe Biden administration, I just think that cost in civil liberties is too high. It might be because I'm a 9/11 baby. It might be because my teens and 20s were seeing the transformation of the American state into a particularly grotesque national security and surveillance state, which I think has had very negative effects on people of color, on left-wing organizers, et cetera. I'm very wary to inflate a threat that I don't think is existential. And then finally, I guess this is a political judgment, but I don't think we need the fascism analogy to get what we want. There is a long, awful history of racism, of authoritarianism, of tyranny in this country. We don't need to other what's happening here by pointing to a profoundly European example, an ideology that came from a very peculiar European context. I think we have our own history that's awful enough, going back to before the founding of the Republic, to the first encounter in what is now Mexico, that we don't need to draw on this othering, very recent analogy that is not particularly similar to what's going on now in my political judgment. So I just want to say I was really nice to hear Jason, and that's where I stand.
Nice. And Sam, and then of course people will have a chance to respond, but do you want to?
Yeah, I'll say a couple of things, but first, it's a pleasure to be here again, and I admire all these folks. I really agree a lot with what's been said, and maybe to combine what Jason and Danny just said, it's absolutely true that we can kind of deploy a left critical vision of anti-fascism. That's who invented it, after all. And it's true that Black radicals have made major contributions to that discourse, but it's not dominant, never has been. And it's not dominant right now. So as Danny says, we need to be very careful that we control the risks. And if you just omit the problem that the centrist mainstream has just declared war on fascism, just as it did after 9/11, then you really haven't reckoned with what's at stake in the analogy. So how do we correctly access the promising features of this tradition while containing its noxious ones? And, if we're not acknowledging both sides there, I think we really haven't been honest. But I want to say something that goes beyond what Danny's, I think, rightly pointed out on this score, which is that we can't just read half the news in our analysis of the Trump administration. So some of us have been arguing throughout that the amazing thing was, in a sense, how weak he turned out to be. That's not fascism.
Right. You and
at least of any kind that we've seen in the past. And even January 6th, which Jason and others are taking to be the great confirmation event, I think more vividly illustrates how weak a man he is. So even before the riot broke out, he'd lost his alliance with Mitch McConnell and Mike Pence, who had resolved to end his, imaginative or symbolic insurrection before the real one took place. And so his ability, which is real and scary, to call out some goons, although we have to debate how many, turns out to be one fact against a set of facts that reveal that we're looking at a different kind of thing, I believe, than the fascism analogy helps us get at. Not that there's not truth to it, but we can't screen out what doesn't fit. Let me make one last point. I really appreciated what Eugene said about Jim Crow and the civil rights movement facing it down. I absolutely believe it can be seen, Jim Crow, as a form of fascism, and indeed we know that it actually inspired Adolf Hitler and his minions to some extent. But it's not factually correct to say that the civil rights movement much posed as an anti-fascist movement. And here's one reason why. Because they knew that there were a lot of people they had to recruit to their side. And fascism is a really hard thing to come back from. So, Jason, maybe mention this briefly, but we have a certain number of folks, punks in Charlottesville and most recently at the Capitol. We can talk about how many, but to get from there to 70 odd million for a man who increased his voting share, including amongst the victims of so-called fascism, I think is a huge challenge. And what we need to do is figure out how this man could win once, could win against the Republican Party and then against Hillary Clinton, who failed, and then increased his gains, while Biden won thanks principally to wealthy suburbanites. And if we don't focus there, then how can we contain this threat? And so I think calling, those whom we can recruit rather than incorrigible fascists is just a mistake, because we have to figure out what we could share with them and why they're not on our side already.
Eugene, you were saying that the civil rights movement was a big anti-fascist movement. Is that?
I'm saying I think we should appreciate the anti-fascist character. I mean, I think Sam is correct historically. I mean, I think if we're sort of looking at just the actual ripple effects of it, I mean, if we even recognize Jim Crow as a form of, at least derivative form of fascism, as it were, I think just the revival of the civil rights movement, of the Reconstruction concept of the 14th Amendment, the revival of the Reconstruction removal laws, the ending of the poll tax, and then, of course, maybe not the final breaking up of the Klan, they're still around, but as a powerful political organization, I think you can certainly say it had anti-fascist echoes. And if to some degree democracy, even in a bourgeois sense, if we're talking about sort of fascism in the European sense, is, if not something of an antithesis to fascism, I think the appreciation for democracy in this country expanded dramatically because of the civil rights movement and the horizon of it and the significance of it. But I think historically, 100% correct. And I think most of the
it's an anti-fascist movement. You were right.
I think the points are well taken in a way across a lot of, I don't know. I'm trying to think.
Were you saying it was were you saying it was anti-fascist in a certain way, or were you saying it opposed fascism? Because Sam, are you saying that they did oppose fascism in their function, but they didn't frame it as an anti-fascist movement?
Correct. I think, of course, if we operate with a black radical interpretation of fascism, well, there was fascism in America before there was in Europe. And that's true on that theory. But that doesn't mean that civil rights activists, even radical ones like Malcolm X, opposed Jim Crow as fascism.
Well,
and I'm trying to figure out why. Well, one reason is that they understood that they were in enough of a democracy that they didn't need to, roll in the US Army to Germany. They needed to win elections and get people on their side. And, calling someone a fascist is a strange way to do it.
Well, I don't know. I would actually disagree slightly. I mean, I do think that they put Hoover in the framework of a fascist, sort of secret police state, even in the 63 era and the early era. So I think it was certainly being drawn. And the evolution, of course, of the civil rights movement into the quote unquote Black Power movement, the more radical phase, the National Committee to Combat Fascism became sort of central organizing principle of the Black Panther Party and was reaching millions of people. So obviously George Jackson and the many different pieces. But I was honestly just making that point as a derivative point about appreciating some of our past history vis-a-vis that. And I know Daniel wants to get in. I'll just say very quickly, I mean, I do think his point is very well taken about sort of looking at our own history of very brutal politics. And to me, I think that is kind of the core of the argument, and why in some ways I think the fascism discourse is important and does take us some of the way there, because I think just the very fact of comparing and contrasting what happened in Germany, what happened in Italy, what is its derivative in America. I mean, I think we could also ask questions in India right now. I mean, obviously Modi is winning elections. There's a very dynamic democratic process in India, but it's also being used and perverted in a way that the love jihads is very problematic. So what is the interplay between sort of things that we think of as fascism? How do we put fascism, authoritarianism? How does that fit in with democracy? I think using the discourse and raising the question is exactly what sort of drives us down the road to really be able to grasp the particularity of it in many ways.
So you were making a term about framing and discourse as opposed to the effect, whether they had an anti-fascist effect. Right? Okay. Daniel, then Jason?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think there's a lot there. And I think it is interesting to compare these sorts of regimes and see how they operate and see sort of the internal characteristics. That's useful. But the thing that I'm talking about when I talk here is really about political efficacy. So to go back to the 1960s, the people, if you look at like the mainstream media, the Times, the Post, the mainstream media, the people who are identified as fascists were the 68 protesters. Right, because what's actually powerful in this country in fascist discourse is it's the way liberals discipline the left in terms of most impact on American politics in the last 60 plus years. It's been deployed by liberals to discipline the left. And as it was in the 1960s, you get much more criticism of SDS as proto-fascist than you get from the civil rights movement calling the Southern state fascists. I think that is an empirical truth.